and invite you all to engage with us and each other in the chat at any time. We're truly thrilled to be connecting with all of you today because today's Real Talk UV event is focused on an issue near and dear to our hearts and our membership as a whole, reproductive freedom, which is sadly viciously under attack. For all of us who've been in the trenches for some time, we know that these attacks didn't happen overnight when Roe v. Wade was overturned 2 years ago. This has been a decades, century-long war by extremist and power-hungry conservatives. Our guests today are here to talk about how a certain law in the books, the Comstock Act, is now being weaponized by these anti-abortion extremists to keep medication abortion and the surgical tools doctors need for the procedure to prevent anyone and everyone from having access to an abortion. The Comstock Act of 1873, yes, you heard that right, 1873, is a law in the books that prohibits the U.S. Postal Service and other carriers from mailing materials deemed obscene, like Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass and the Canterbury Tales. This largely dormant law was used as justification by Texas anti-abortion judge Matthew Kacsmaryk to prohibit mail-order abortion medication, specifically mifepristone. Comstock could also be used to ban abortion nationwide by blocking abortion clinics from getting medical supplies. The policy could even be enforced to stop medication from reaching people with HIV and AIDS and restrict access to books that discuss women's history. As long as Congress keeps Comstock on the books, right-wing extremists will have a powerful tool to control our lives. Here with us to discuss the far-reaching ramifications of the Comstock Act and what we can do to fight back are our speakers today, Jodi Jacobson, David Cohen, and Sarah Lipton-Lubet. Jodi is the founder and executive director of Healthcare Across Borders, an initiative to ensure everyone in the United States can access essential reproductive, sexual, and gender-affirming care, irrespective of where they live. Throughout her career, Jodi has worked extensively with democracy and health movements worldwide to shape law and policy on public health, human rights, and evidence-based care in international agencies at the United Nations and in the United States. Welcome, Jodi.
Thank you so much.
David Cohen is a professor of law at Drexel University in Philadelphia. David's scholarship explores the intersection of constitutional law and gender with an emphasis on how the law impacts abortion provision. In the wake of the reversal of Roe v. Wade, Professor Cohen has been one of the leading national experts on abortion access. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Sarah Lipton-Lubet is president of Take Back the Court Action Fund, whose mission is to inform the public about the danger that the Supreme Court poses to democracy and about the viability of court expansion, adding seats to the court, as the only strategy that rebalances the court after its 2016 theft. For the better part of the last 2 decades, Sarah has been an advocate for reproductive freedom, gender equity, and progressive change. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Of course, our speakers are so much more than what I just described. Feel free to go to their respective organizations' websites for their longer biographies. Mary or Kathy will put those websites in the chat. Thank you. Okay, let's get started with our program. Thank you, Kathy, for pressing the record button. Okay, so just in the news today, it appears that the Supreme Court accidentally, briefly published on its website the decision regarding the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, known as EMTALA. For folks who haven't been following this case, the U.S. Justice Department had sued Idaho for prohibiting doctors from terminating pregnancies that threaten the mother's health. It appears that Idaho may have lost this decision on a 6-3 vote with Kavanaugh, Roberts, and Barrett voting with the 3 liberal justices. What are your reactions to this decision? Let's start with our legal expert, David.
So this was a big surprise, like you said. We were all looking at people who follow the Supreme Court, watch at 10 o'clock in the morning to see if there are decisions, and 10 o'clock came, this decision didn't come out, and then around 1 o'clock today, Bloomberg said that there was this leak. If this is the ultimate decision, and we don't know that, we won't know that for another day or two, it's really good for Idaho. It's much better than a bad decision because basically the Supreme Court is saying, we're not taking this case right now. And they're going to let the Idaho lower court decision, which blocked the Idaho abortion law in cases of emergencies, take effect for now. There still will have to be a full trial in the case, and it could come back to the court in a few years. But that's going to be really good news for Idaho if this turns out to be the case. But there's a big, big footnote to that statement. What the court has a different case, there's a different EMTALA case out of Texas that had a terrible decision in the Texas appeals court, which covers Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. That decision is not affected by today's case. And so that decision remains. So and if you're thinking about numbers, the 2 million people who live in Idaho benefit from what might happen. But the 38 million people who live in Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana are living under a terrible regime where if you have an emergency that sends you to the hospital and you need an abortion, you do not get one because of the state's abortion bans. And that has not been affected by what the Supreme Court's about to do. So this is really good for Idaho, but it is not a blanket EMTALA applies everywhere ruling, which is what would have been the best case outcome.
Thank you, David. And Sarah, do you have anything to add?
I have a slightly more, a slightly less rosy take on the case, or on the potential opinion, excuse me, that was leaked today, which is yes to everything David said. It's a reprieve for pregnant folks in Idaho, which they greatly need. Doesn't do anything to help people living in the Fifth Circuit. And also, stepping back from that, it is just such a brazenly political act and set of opinions by a brazenly political court. And we see that so clearly in what was, accidentally released today. Justice Alito, who I think to date I have never agreed with in my entire life, and I hope never to again, says in his dissent in this case that this is just a political act by justices essentially who don't want to weigh in on this charged issue before November. I added before November, but I think it's what he's saying. And I think that's what they're doing. So I think it's really important to, if this ends up being what they're doing, really important to know that this is a kick the can. This will come back to the court in one way or another, either through the Fifth Circuit case that David described or through this case. So it's really just, I think, a delay tactic to try to quell concerns in an election year.
Thank you, Sarah, for that point of view. And actually, my next question is for you. Were you surprised when Texas Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk used the Comstock Act as justification to bar the mailing of mifepristone? Before the mifepristone case, were there other cases in recent history in which a judge used the Comstock Act to justify restricting abortion access?
So I think I'm just going to continue on, and these right-wing judges are politicians in robes theme, because I think the short answer to your question, was I surprised? It's yes and no, right? Comstock hadn't been used with respect to abortion for nearly 100 years. And every serious person engaged in this work agrees that the Comstock Act had effectively been taken out of commission for this purpose, that courts nearly a century ago had determined that it shouldn't be enforced with respect to medical care, that Congress had affirmed that understanding, and that is the way that a kind of stand-up judge, an honest judge, would have interpreted that law, that series of cases. But we know that the judges and the justices in the anti-abortion movement, they still work hand in hand with. They're not serious about fair interpretations of the law. They're serious about banning abortion and all sorts of other healthcare at all cost. So, of course, activists like Kazmierek would bolster ADF's specious claims, no matter how far outside the bounds of a fair interpretation. So yes and no.
And I have the same question I have a similar question for David. What other cases have you heard the Comstock Act being weaponized by the right in this way? How long have you known that this archaic law was a problem?
Before Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court 2 years ago, there were, people talking about how the possibility of Comstock coming back could be a threat to abortion rights. Like Sarah said, it hadn't been really used for almost a century, but it was still on the books, at least with respect to abortion. In 1971, they got rid of the contraception provision in Comstock. And I think there were some people who thought they got rid of the whole thing, but they didn't. They got rid of the contraception part. And because of a series of these cases from the 1920s and 1930s, the abortion part really meant nothing. But there was a concern that it could come back. And I think to the extent that, there's some second guessing of some things that happened before Roe was overturned, there was kind of a concerted effort in the pro-choice movement not to mention Comstock before the decision in Dobbs, with the fear, we might give them an idea, but they know everything. Just like, we know we know what they're thinking, they know what we're thinking. And I think, we didn't talk about Comstock beforehand, and maybe we should have. I'm guilty of this too. Maybe we should have been talking about Comstock and saying in 2021, the spring of 2022, that if the Supreme Court overturns Roe, watch out, they're coming after all abortion because of Comstock. But we didn't say that. Instead, we kind of kept it to ourselves. But then soon after Dobbs, the real extremists in the anti-abortion movement, they just started talking about Comstock. And I don't know if the rest of the anti-abortion movement really wanted them to. The mainstream of the anti-abortion movement in 2022 probably wanted everyone to shut up about Comstock. But you couldn't stop Jonathan Mitchell, you couldn't stop Mark Lee Dixon from talking about Comstock, and they were excited. And they started doing various little legal things, nothing major, but that talked about Comstock. So there were some briefs filed and some cases that were pending about Comstock as a national abortion ban. They tried to get local communities in New Mexico, Colorado, and Illinois and Ohio to pass local ordinances that referred to Comstock, saying that in our community, you can't mail abortion pills because of Comstock. They threatened abortion clinics in Utah for violating Comstock by mailing abortion pills, while Utah continued to allow abortion and still does to this day. And then in the case that you and Sarah were talking about, in the actual complaint filed in that case, they said one of the reasons why the FDA could not have properly approved mifepristone was because it's illegal to mail it under Comstock. Mm-hmm. And that was probably their highest profile use of Comstock. And then more and more people started talking about it, right? Instead of sort of shoving it down and saying, let's be quiet about this, more and more started talking about it. So you have some politicians signing, you know, I think it was 100 some odd members of Congress filed a brief in the mifepristone case talking about Comstock and saying it bans mailing pills. You have the Heritage Foundation with Project 2025 saying that the next president, if he's a Republican anti-abortion president, needs to come in and vigorously enforce Comstock. Now, they don't use the word Comstock. If you search Project 2025, you're not going to see the word Comstock, but you will see the statute, which is 1461, 1462 of the US Criminal Code, which is 18. You'll see the number, but you won't see the word Comstock. And then Justices Thomas and Justice Alito talked about Comstock in the oral argument in the mifepristone case. So it's almost like each month you get a little more mainstream reference to Comstock. They're not backing down about this, and their interpretation is so broad that, and it's really not based in history, but it's so broad that it would prohibit all abortion everywhere. And that's why when I talk about this, to me, it is the #1 issue facing abortion right now. Because if they get control of the Department of Justice in January, with the interpretation that they've been laying out for the past 2 years, it would ban abortion everywhere, even in the states that have legal abortion. And so they've made it clear what they want to do, and it's up to us to listen and stop what they're trying to do.
Wow. And by the way, why don't they say the word Comstock?
I think some of them think it has a sort of bad connotation for all the reasons that, you know, you laid out in the beginning. It's from 1873. It's with someone who is a Victorian ideas about sex, about women, about prudishness with respect to anything around your body. So, you know, I don't know if they want to be some don't want to be associated with that. And so they use the number. And the number doesn't have the association with 1873 and with Anthony Comstock.
Okay, well, I'm going to start saying Comstock every opportunity I get. All right, so my next question is for Jodi. I know that in our movement or coalition to repeal the Comstock Act, there is this fear that the Comstock Act could be used for more than banning abortion, banning AIDS medications, for example, and even women's studies textbooks. In the past, when we've raised similar alarm bells, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the far right has gaslit us and even convinced middle-of-the-road voters like suburban white mothers that this was far-fetched. What do you say to folks who think the Comstock Act isn't mainstream or it's far-fetched, that it could be used for more than banning abortion?
Jodi, you're on mute. Sorry about that. It's a really good question, and I think it's sort of important to put things in context. In my eyes, I have never seen the right wing not do things that are well beyond what people think they're going to do, right? In 2006, I think it was, in South Dakota, a 20-week abortion ban was soundly defeated by popular vote. And then the legislature went ahead and passed it anyway. So there have been moves, anti-democratic moves, and also reaching past people to ban abortion and ban things like, you know, to really expand the purview of what people can get and cannot get, to control people's reproduction and sexuality. I saw this when I was working on HIV and AIDS legislation internationally and here in the United States. The right would constantly either denigrate the science behind certain HIV prevention methods or HIV prevention strategies, or it would call them obscene or, you know, anti-biblical or whatever. So my point here is that there is no end to what they will do or what they will find to do what they want to do. And so I'm not at all surprised that they're reaching for Comstock, because it's something right now that it sort of fits within a normal legal argument, right? It fits within a normal legal argument. But what I keep saying to people is if we were to have another Trump administration, I think we're beyond normal legal arguments. We are in a place where we have an administration that has admitted it is going to effectively, completely shift the entire federal government apparatus. So I don't know whether they would need Comstock per se, because if they did, basically gut the FDA and completely change the Justice Department to be an arm of the White House and do all those things they're talking about, there's lots of things they could do because they don't believe in the law that we have, and they clearly don't believe in precedent. So my fear is not just around Comstock, but about what the right wants to do based on experience, what they have done. We moved from a conversation in the late 1990s of abortion and people scoffing at the idea that they might want to ban contraception to that becoming much more mainstream in the right wing and becoming more and more clear that they do want to do that. They do want to ban contraception. And you have to listen carefully and also tie back to historical processes they've gone through where they sort of say something, it might sound like it's floating a balloon, but they're out there doing those things and they're making it normalized. So I fear that they would use Comstock or other means to, in fact, prohibit the mailing and distribution of HIV and AIDS prevention, of, things that they don't agree with on any level. And you can twist words like what is obscene or what is prurient or what have you to redefine them in your own, to make your own definition for those things. And I've just watched this happen my entire career over and over and over again. So it's not that I'm claiming that's what they will do, but I think that's what they want to do. And when I see that happening, I feel like we can't waste any time leaving things in place that might facilitate those actions, which is why I think Comstock is bad law and needs to be repealed, and why there's so many other areas where we need to be both on the hunt for things that are dangerous, landmines in the law, but also proactive in setting the stage that we want to see for healthcare. Because let's just focus for a second on what these things mean. We already have the highest rates of pregnancy-related death and illness in countries of similar economic growth or circumstances, right? Now in Texas, post the abortion ban, there has been a major increase in maternal mortality and illness among Black women. It was already really high in Texas. It's now much higher after the abortion ban, and this is based on state data. And then you've got now a crisis of infant mortality that has increased dramatically post-ban, because abortion is linked to infant survival for a lot of reasons we don't have time for now. But the point is that we are looking at already massive public health crises, and they are just going to get better, which is why the Intala case is so critical, because you have people who will be on the verge of death in a hospital where they should be getting care, and they won't get it.
Said from a woman who has seen a lot. Thank you, Jodi. So recently, Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota and House Representative Becca Balint of Vermont, they have introduced a bill to repeal the Comstock Act. Jodi, walk us through the lay of the land here. What is the plan?
I think the plan is still evolving, but my understanding, and we had wanted to see a bill earlier this year, have a bill introduced earlier this year, and get a vote on that bill, because the assumption and the working premise was that the earlier we could get the bill in Congress and get a vote on it, the earlier that people could use it as a warning sign and an educational tool, right? When you have something that you can focus people's attention on and begin to talk about why it's a problem, then you've got a tool you can use for public awareness. There are a lot of reasons that did not happen, not least of which were the sort of hanging Supreme Court cases that we were waiting on, and counter pressures in different parts of the movement about whether that was a good strategy or not. And now we're in a place where we've got a bill introduced. It's a partial repeal bill, and it will not get a vote is my take. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't believe it will get a vote. Because in order to get that vote, we need a tremendous amount of pressure that would have to also come from legacy groups, and they have shown not to be interested in having that vote. So our coalition, of which you're part, so talking, not telling you anything you don't know, is wanting to stay on this issue and get to the point where we can write the bill we want to see in the next Congress and get this repeal. Because like I said, even if the right wing doesn't win the White House this year, there is a major right wing movement here and across the world. They are all in collaboration with each other. They work with each other on a daily basis. And we cannot afford to leave things hanging around that could potentially be used for nefarious purposes. And to my mind, when people are dying from lack of care, it's a nefarious purpose when you have a law that will further increase those deaths.
Thank you, Jodi. And David, are you seeing any legal challenges to the Comstock Act, or is ending it legislatively the way to go?
Right now it's legislative and political. I mean, it's not just, I think the goal is to remove it, but the goal is also to use it to rally people to vote for pro-choice people who do not want it enforced. Because the reality is we don't have the votes in Congress right now unless people switch parties, which maybe they would because this law is so horrible. But if we stick with the party line voting right now in Congress, we don't have the votes to repeal it. But what we do have is the platform to make people vote based on which party will enforce the Comstock Act in the extremist way and which party will not. And so, right now, the biggest ways to stop Comstock are legislative and voting. That doesn't mean people aren't thinking about legal strategies down the line. They are. But since there are no prosecutions under the abortion provision in Comstock, there is no legal action to take because there's no even threat of prosecution because the Biden administration is not enforcing it in any way like the Jonathan Mitchells of the world want. So no one can go to court to try and stop something that's not happening. It doesn't work that way. But rest assured, people are thinking about ways to challenge the Comstock Act if needed. But it would be nice if we never got to that point by repealing it. That's the best case scenario. Second best case scenario, never voting for and putting in office someone who will enforce it the way Jonathan Mitchell wants.
Thank you. I'm switching
Can I
gears.
add something?
Yes, go
This is
for
okay.
it, Sarah.
Yeah, just building on what David was just saying. And I think it's both like let's repeal and let's never elect someone who would ever use it. And one of the most important things that we can be doing right now toward that end is talking about Comstock, talking about it all the time to everyone you know. Because here's the thing, most people have never heard of it.
Yep.
Right? It's something I, took a gender studies course on, I can tell you how many decades ago. But most people have never heard of it. When you explain to people what Comstock is, recent polling has shown that 70% of people want it repealed. But if you just ask them if they know what it is, about 70% of people have never heard of it before. So that it shows us like how much work there is to do and also what the payoff is of that work between now and November.
Thank you for adding that, Sarah. Yes, after this discussion, I'm definitely going to say Comstock as much as possible. I'm going to cut our Q&A a little short so we can open it up to audience questions, but it's an election year, and surely I'm not the only one having the jitters here. So far, every time abortion is on the ballot, we've won. We even won a special election in a deep red district in the deep red state of Alabama earlier this year. How are you all feeling about the elections in November? If anything, we should be sounding the alarm on the Comstock Act and anything and everything that has to do with abortion access, right?
I don't know who you're posing the question to, but yes. Yes, we
Yes,
should.
all
That's my
three of
answer,
you.
yes.
Yes.
So and in addition to yes, I would add that yes, you know, we've won more abortion's been on the ballot. We can't just count on that though. I mean, I keep coming in with all the polling numbers or estimates, you know, give or take. But it was shocking to me, frankly, to see how few people blame Trump for overturning Roe. It's something like, I don't know, 20-something%. People don't think it's his fault. People don't think that he really cares all that much about abortion because he's this kind of freewheeling billionaire, thrice married, yada, yada, yada. They don't think he's a true believer. And, you know, part of our job as people who care about abortion access, I'll just put that hat on, is to help people like understand and close that gap. And whether or not, almost doesn't matter if you think he's a true believer. Okay, we don't need to convince you of that. The people he has surrounded himself with, the people who are planning for a second Trump administration, they are true believers of the truest sort. And they're planning, you know, to use Comstock in the way that we've been talking about today, and a whole other raft of horrible, horrible things. There's a believability gap in some ways, because it seems too awful to think it's going to be real. And that's something that has me nervous going into the fall.
Yeah, and sort of the flip side of that is sort of the same thing. You can sort of say the same thing about Biden, right? Whether you think he's a true believer on abortion rights because of his sort of cloudy past on the issue, it doesn't really matter, because the people he surrounded himself with are, and the people in charge of the various departments of health and Department of Justice and FDA and his vice president and the party apparatus around him have moved so far on abortion in a way that I think, you know, one of the positives around Dobbs, you know, Dobbs is a terrible decision. It should have never happened. It needs to be overturned the second we possibly can. But it has moved the Democratic Party in a crazy way on abortion really quickly. Right? They are all talking about abortion. Now, maybe it's for craven political reasons because they know it wins, but I don't care. They're talking about it. They're doing things. States that never did anything before because they sat on their they just did nothing because they didn't think they needed to do anything, have been doing things. They've been spending money. They've been repealing laws. They've been passing new laws. They've been protecting providers and patients. You know, Dobbs did that. They were not doing these things for the 50 years we were all screaming, Roe isn't enough, right? They were not doing much, but now they are. And so, you know, just like Sarah said, whether Trump's a true believer on anti-abortion sort of doesn't matter. Whether Biden's a true believer on abortion rights doesn't really matter either, because the stark difference between the party apparatus is so clear, what you're going to get. And so for anyone voting in November who cares about abortion, we need to be talking about these things, and a lot of people care about abortion. That's one of the things we've seen too.
Before I open it up to audience questions, I have one last question for the three of you. Very rapidly, you three are amazing. We want to help you, all of us here on Zoom. What can we do as individuals to get the word out about the Comstock Act and win? Maybe start with you, Jodi.
Well, we're going to start producing some materials that people can use to get discussions among people that don't know. Like if you have a book group, or you have a discussion group or a politics group, or you're working with people who are doing some canvassing, we'd like to see folks get educated about this as a reason to be concerned about the outcome of the election and to be motivated about the election, not just there's a whole array of reasons that you should be motivated around the election. The courts, the laws that are on the books, the ones that are not yet on the books, there are lots of things, but this is a critical effort to remove this law. And I think just educating yourself and educating people is really critical. And that's why we formed a coalition that includes, people from across a diverse set of groups that also include large memberships, because we know that that's what it takes to make things happen.
I mean, I think what everyone can do is just talk about Comstock. I mean, talk about it. Tell everyone you know, write letters to the editor, call up your representative and ask their position on Comstock, demand they answer you, call your senators, ask their position on Comstock. Once you find out their position, talk to people about their position, right? I think one of the values of having these two bills in the House and the Senate is getting people hopefully on the record, whether by vote or by people asking them, what is their position on repealing these provisions in Comstock? Find out what their position is and advertise it. And then let people vote accordingly.
Sounds good. Sarah?
Ditto, Jodi and David. Do those things, please.
Wonderful.
thank
And
you.
then last word, UltraViolet is going to drop in the chat an actual petition that we plan to deliver to every member of Congress in support of repealing